Hej och välkomna till vår föreläsning idag. En av de 10 som markerar vår institutionens stora jubileum, 50-årsjubileum. Och jag har den stora äran att välkomna professor Elisabet Tiselius, vår fantastiska föreläsare idag. Hej Elisabet!
Hej, tack så mycket och vilken fin introduktion.
Tackar. We'll switch to English now. I allowed myself to give a short introduction in our speaker's mother tongue, which is Swedish, obviously. And Professor Tiselius is going to give a fascinating talk today entitled Exploring Cognitive Processes in Dialogue Interpreting. Professor Tiselius is a renowned scholar, teacher, and practitioner. And starting from the latter, perhaps, she's a professional interpreter authorized by the Swedish authorization agency named Kammarkollegiet. And she's also a member of the International Association of Conference Interpreters. She's also an accredited conference interpreter to the European institutions with working languages, English, French, Danish, and Swedish. And as a scholar, Professor Tiselius is an associate professor at Stockholm's University, the University of Stockholm, and she works at the Institute for Interpreting and Translation Studies. Her main research interests are cognitive processes in interpreting and translation, and within this area, she has published a multitude of articles, journal chapters, where she takes up various practical aspects of the interpreting process. And these range from intercultural competence, distressful situations, interpretation in pediatric oncology care, accuracy in interpretation, and also experience and expertise in interpretation. She co-edited, very recently, she co-edited the Routledge Handbook of Conference Interpreting, which was published in 2021. She's also a member of the editorial board of In Context, Studies in Translation and Interculturalism. She's active in 4 ongoing research projects. I'll briefly mention 2 of them. Very interesting. One of them is closely related to the subject of Professor Tiselius' talk today. It is funded by the Swedish Research Council, and it's called The Invisible Process, Cognition and Working Memory of Dialogue Interpreting. And another research project is DPICT, quite interesting for our sign language team, I guess, because DPICT stands for Signed Language Depiction as an engine for promoting inclusion, communication, and translation. It is a project funded by the Norwegian Research Council. Other research interests of Professor Tiselius, one fascinating area to my mind is about children as language brokers for their families and the communicative processes of children in families where the proficiency of Swedish is limited. And last but not least, Elisabet Tiselius is a well-known, renowned teacher at the Institute for Interpreting and Translation Studies at Stockholm's University, where she surveys, develops, and monitors the assessment of entrance tests and final tests, and where she also works with pedagogical, didactical approaches to interpreting training. And after this brief introduction, I shall ask Professor Tiselius to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this wonderful introduction, especially in Swedish, but also the rest. And for those of you who listen to everything that I do or have done, I must stress that this is done over a long time. I don't have any children who live at home anymore, and I collaborate with a lot of people. So my day and night only have 24 hours, just as yours. So, you know, step by step, you do things, and nothing is done alone, of course. And having said all that, I'm very happy to, oh no, you can't see my screen yet. I started my PowerPoint without having shared my screen, so that doesn't help, of course. So here we are. Now you see my PowerPoint, right? And I can start it. So now you should see my PowerPoint in presentation mode, right? Great, thank you so much. And before I start, I would also like to thank you for inviting me once again, although this time on distance. But for once, I'm very happy that we're on distance because I wouldn't have been able to participate otherwise. And perhaps some of you heard me already when I was visiting in 2019. And if so, some parts may be a little repetition, but I hope that I also bring new things to the table, because as I said, was said in the presentation, I do have a big research project on cognitive processes in dialogue interpreting. And what I'm trying to do today is to present some of the findings that we actually have now. We are almost 5 years into the project. The PhD student who's working in the project is soon finished, and we start indeed to see a few things about dialogue interpreting. So this is what I'm hopefully going to share with you today, and also maybe interesting for you as well that Polish is one of the languages in among the participants that we have in the study. So Polish is one of the languages that we cover in this research. But what we're talking about today is dialogue interpreting, as I've said, and it is the type of interpreting which is a very short consecutive interpreting, and it is often equaled with public service interpreting because it's so very common to use dialogue interpreting in the public service sector. But I'd like to stress that public service interpreters also do longer consecutives or even simultaneous, but whispered simultaneous most of the time, of course. So therefore, I'd like to stress that I'm looking at the dialogue interpreting context. So we could perhaps assume that it could take place in other contexts as well, outside the public sector. And yeah, so what you see here, two people meet and an interpreter mediates between the two people. And what I also always do in my lectures is getting back to this Pöchacker quote, which he in turn adapted from Otto Kade about what interpreting is, because I think it's important to start from there before I start telling you what dialogue interpreting is. So Kade says that, or Pöchacker says that it's a form of translation in which a first and final rendition in another language is produced on the basis of a one-time presentation of an utterance in a source language. And this is really the core of interpreting, but obviously, when you look at dialogue interpreting, there has to be some adaptations in order to really identify what dialogue interpreting is. Because if we want to understand dialogue interpreting in particular, I think, but maybe also other types of interpreting, we have to look at the context. And the context in dialogue interpreting is this idea of it being a very short consecutive interpreting, because even though many of us, especially those of us who worked as conference interpreter and who was trained in consecutive interpreting with notes, we say that a consecutive interpreting is a fairly long monologue, right? But in this case, we're looking at a very short consecutive interpreting, often without notes, often utterance by utterance. There are two or sometimes more participants in one conversation, and the interpreter always works in both directions. It is very common, as I said before, in the public sector, for instance, in medical encounters, in job counseling, and it may even have some simultaneous elements. I mean, in sign language, of course, the whole dialogue interpreting is simultaneous, or most of it, because it's very rare in the sign language context that the dialogue, that one person stops and has the interpreter interpret. But for the reason of us using the same sound mode, perhaps, we have to stop and let the interpreter interprets. But in some cases, the changing of the turn, or for other reasons, the dialogue interpreter may decide to do some kind of a few moments of simultaneous interpreting as well. And most of the studies that we've seen in dialogue interpreting have used conversation analysis, I'd say. It's conversation analysis, or it's on the basis of interviews with interpreters or questionnaires around interpreting. But when we study, in many cases, dialogue interpreting, we have done so by recording the interpreted event and then analyzed it by using conversation analysis. And my colleague in Stockholm, Cecilia Badensjö, is of course the name to mention here in conversation analysis. Other features of dialogue interpreting is that the interpreter's rendition are a target text of a preceding utterance and a point of the department for the next source text. So this means, in plain speech, that when the interpreter renders something, it's the target text of what has been said, but the actual answer, the other party's answer, is not an answer to the original language. It's an answer to the interpreter's utterance. So that means that it starts with the next source text. It is also this type of very close encounter where the participants, where the interpreter is the hub of the interaction between the participants. And this, I would say, although there are some big differences between dialogue interpreting online and dialogue interpreting on site, I would still say that this kind of close, physical closeness, although I don't know if you can say that when you're online, but still physical closeness to the participants and being the hub of the interaction is true in dialogue interpreting, regardless of the greater context. The interpreter also must monitor both their own comprehension and output, just as for any other type of interpreting, but the interpreter also monitors the participants' contribution to the dialogue and their understanding in turn of the dialogue. And they do have an active role in turn taking. So you may, at a glance, one may experience dialogue interpreting as the parties, the main participants in the conversation are the ones driving the conversation forward. But when you start analyzing that, and Cecilia Badensjö has showed that very well in her research, the interpreter takes a very active role in the turn taking without necessarily stopping people to say that now you can't speak anymore or now you're allowed to speak, but by minimal signals driving the role taking of the participants. Let's see where I am. Yeah, and furthermore, since as I said before, since the interpreter produces utterances into the two languages of the conversation, it also means that the interpreter may have to deal with asymmetrical levels of their own language knowledge in the two working languages. Because ideally, we say that interpreters should have an equal level of their at least two working languages. If you work into two languages, you must have either native level of your languages or very advanced language knowledge, like A and B. But the truth is also that for many interpreters in the public sector, they work into a language which they have acquired at an older age, so not as children perhaps, and therefore may still have asymmetrical language knowledge of the two languages. And this is something that they also deal with, and which also, of course, which I'm coming to, is something that can affect the cognition or the cognitive resources of the interpreter. When we started this project, we came up with this image. We came up with it, and I still think that it's important to, as a sort of model of what goes into the interpreting process. What is it that the interpreter actually has to have as sub-skills in order for the interpreting process to happen? And we didn't make this list of the necessary sub-skills. In fact, we collected it from the literature, because as you may agree with me that there are a lot of literature on what an interpreter needs to master in order to be able to interpret. And this has nothing to do with, oops, sorry, I don't know why it works on its own. And this has nothing to do with whether this has nothing to do with the core of the interpreting process, if you see what I mean. But because we can agree on that all these necessary skills and sub-skills is something that a person can master without still being able to interpret. But we can also agree on that if one doesn't have mastery of these sub-skills, the interpreting process will suffer. The cognitive resources will suffer. So the necessary sub-skills are listening, comprehension, memory, note-taking, public speaking, speech production, transfer into two languages and sometimes in simultaneous, interaction, management. This means turn-taking and face threats, attentional capacity management, non-verbal communication, monitoring of comprehension and production, as I just said, and problem solving. And then we also listed the supporting knowledge. Language knowledge and general and specific background knowledge is perhaps not crucial for the interpreting process, but will give you, language knowledge is crucial, sorry. Of course, if you don't have the two languages, that's a no-go. But the knowledge may or may not make it easier for you. But one thing that I think we can agree on is that if you don't have the general and specific background knowledge, again, your cognitive resources will suffer because you have to focus much more on the unknown things. So all these things have an impact on the interpreting process. And we may know how much impact it has, or we may not know, but anyway, it has some kind of effect into that. And some of these are what we have tried to look at in our project. Another important part of dialogue interpreting is the turn-taking and coordination. And I just want to remind you that when I talk about turn-taking, it is the sequence of a talk when one speaker has the exclusive right to the word, and turn-taking is about who's talking when and who decides who's allowed to talk. It is rooted in common and mutual norms, and there are differences, for instance, between languages and cultures and gender. And I lost my thread, I'm sorry. Yes, and it has been shown in research on dialogue interpreting that it is crucial for dialogue interpreting. The management of the turn is crucial for successful dialogue interpreting. And Helen Tebel even goes as far as to say that it's a sine qua non that the dialogue interpreter coordinates the dialogue implicitly. And now we're back to what I said a couple of slides ago, that even though we may think that it is the main participants who drive the conversation. In fact, the interpreter is to a great extent responsible for the management of the turn. And then we have a lot of assumptions about cognitive interpreting. Like the fact that the fundamental conditions of dialogue interpreting, the fact that it's a three-party dialogue and that you get immediate feedback as to whether your interpreting was understood or not, that impacts the process requirement, and that it also put more cognitive load on monitoring, coordination, and ethical awareness. So the fact that the dialogue interpreter is in this closed circle of the main participants and in the interaction also very closely linked to them, and how they speak and what they talk about and the ethical awareness of the situation will have an impact on the cognitive load on the dialogue interpreter. And having said all this about interpreting, I'm now going to turn to cognition before I go further to talk about what we actually did about this, about dialogue interpreting and cognition. And this is just a very short reminder that cognition is a conscious intellectual activity, such as thinking, reasoning, or remembering. Now, I know that there may be also parts of the cognition which are unconscious, but what we're mainly interested in, especially when we try to study dialogue interpreting, is the conscious part of it. It is also defined by Oxford as the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and senses. So by making assumptions and conclusions on what you already know, you can acquire knowledge or understanding, which I think seems logical in an interpreted encounter of, small interpreted encounter between 2 or maybe 3 people. And finally, the cognitive processes that I talk about is to use, one way of defining it is that we make use of our existing knowledge to generate new knowledge. So, in dialogue interpreting, going back to that, if we combine dialogue interpreting and cognition, the dialogue interpreter perceives an utterance in one language, render it in its entirety into another languages, and then we have the cognitive processes of perceiving, understanding, remembering or storing, transfer, and produce the message then into the other language. And this production of the message could be both concurrent and consecutive. So we can either do it at the same time or we can do it consecutively, so after an utterance has been uttered. Now, these cognitive processes, just for a minute, they are not new. I think Nida was the first one who, in translation, proposed more or less the same processes as part of a translation, and they are obviously the ones that we still refer to. But I think that you all can agree with me also that this is, even if we don't know exactly all the cognitive processes involved, perhaps not less so when we come to the transfer moment, which is still very much secluded to us. But we know that this is part of what has to be there in order to produce a dialogue interpreting. Sorry, an interpreting of any type, but a dialogue in my case. In order for these cognitive processes to happen, we have to make use of our working memory. And the interpreter's working memory is working in order to monitor and coordinate these different processes. So the processes of perceiving, understanding, remembering, and storing, etc. But it is also working on problem solving. So what happens when one of these parts of the processes does not function? How can we solve the problem? What to do when in our process we stand in front of something that we can't solve immediately, such as we don't hear what they say, we don't understand what they say, we forgot the word that we were supposed to transfer, or the transfer breaks down because I don't know what this means and I can't produce it in the other language. And the monitoring is not only monitoring the processes that is ongoing, but it also monitors myself, how I do it. For instance, what we have launched as a possible part of dialogue interpreting, that we have a cognitive constraint, meaning that there is a constraint to how much we can remember, store, or understand at the same time. And as I said earlier, also monitoring the other participants in the conversation, their access to the conversation, but also their understanding of the conversation. And something which is different from dialogue interpreting than simultaneous interpreting is that a lot of things might be cognitively more challenging in dialogue interpreting, but the simultaneous interpreter can offload the input all the time because I speak while I'll interpret. So I don't have to retain a certain chunk in my memory in order to then offload it consecutively. And as opposed to consecutive interpreters who do longer consecutive monologues, dialogue interpreters also, not to the same extent at least, offload by taking notes. So there is this chunk of cognitive constraint that I need to deal with. So therefore, we got really interested in the monitoring of the dialogue interpreters. We were after something that that monitoring is really at the heart of the dialogue interpreting process, and therefore something that we wanted to look into more deeply. And here I should mention that I'm not alone in this, in my project. Of course, I have worked very closely together with Professor Birgitta Englund Dimitrova at Stockholm University. Together we have been the project leaders of this project. And we also have our PhD student, Alexandra Adler, in the project. So we are 3 people working on this cognition in dialogue interpreting. And as I said, the dialogue interpreter monitors their own interpreting process, but they also coordinate the turn taking and the plan ahead of the interaction. Now, sorry for this horrible, horrible slide. I have to work on a nicer, I don't know, illustration of the monitoring. But this is what we did when we decided to look more into monitoring, was that we were looking at what the dialogue interpreter actually monitored, what type of processes they monitor. And we identify, at least, there may be more, but we have identified 6 different cognitive sub-processes of dialogue interpreting. And 3 of these sub-processes are more prominent when the interpreter listens, and the other 3 are more prominent when the interpreter speaks. And when one of the primary parties speaks and the interpreter listens, then the interpreter monitors their own comprehension of that utterance, the relation of that utterance to the interpreter's recent rendition. So meaning that when somebody utters something which is a response to the other party, the interpreter can also check if my translation was understood as it was intended. And then they also monitor their own memory and processing capacity, which means that they have to monitor if they want to take the turn. So if someone speaks for too long, they have to find a way to interrupt, because otherwise they won't have enough memory and processing capacity. And when the interpreter speaks, then the interpreter monitors their own utterance in relation to the given language. So does it, what I say now, does it make sense in the language I intend to say it in? And then the relationship between their own utterance and the primary party's previous utterance. Admittedly, not all interpreting utterances are rendition of a primary party's utterance. I may say, I need a break, or I'm sorry, can you repeat, or I didn't understand, or something like that. But if it is an utterance which is the rendition of a primary party's utterance, then I will check that it makes sense compared to what was said by the person who just spoke. And they also monitor verbal and non-verbal reactions of the primary parties. So what we did when we had gone through all these different cognitive sub-processes was that we came up with a definition of monitoring in the context of dialogue interpreting. And this definition goes as follows, that the interpreter's monitoring is a cognitive process through which they observe, evaluate, and possibly take actions. They could repair or do something else, ask for clarification, relating to their own cognitive processing and that of the other participants in the interpreting event. And there's also one more thing that I need to talk about before I go on to the interpreting process and what we have been looking into. And that is the concept of professional self-concept. And why that is important is because it tells us something about how monitoring may differ depending on the experience or the knowledge of the interpreter. And the professional self-concept is the cognitive component of the self. It is the way we think about ourselves. So the self is not innate. It is not a fixed cumulative average of successive self-images, but rather a complex, organized, and dynamic set of images, cognitions, learned beliefs, and evaluations about the selves. Because of its huge size and internal inconsistency, only part of the whole set is activated in any given situation into a working self-concept. So this is a definition by Munoz Martin. He was not the first to discuss self-concept, but he's one of the ones who has discussed it both in translation and interpreting. And what we're after here is that a working self-concept is what you can bring to the situation, which will tell you how to handle this situation compared to any other situation and what to do exactly in this context. So meaning that an experienced interpreter who has been to a lot of similar medical encounters will know exactly what to do in that encounter, and therefore the professional self-concept will be stronger and also releasing cognitive resources from the interpreter, who can then focus more on what is actually going to be interpreted. And finally, I think, the interpreting process. Now, this is something that I've worked on. I'm the first to admit that this is not an ideal model, but what I've tried to do here is to identify the cognitive processes at the top, the perceiving, understanding, transferring, producing, and coordination, as I talked about. I have also identified the professional self-concept, which has an impact on the interpreted event. The monitoring, of course, which serves to monitor the whole interpreted event, and the cognitive load, which is what affects our cognitive abilities or cognitive resources into producing a successful interpreting at any given time. And this is all part of the interpreting process, but the only thing that I can really study in any given situation is the interpreted event. And with this, we went into the project, which is the project called The Invisible Process, and which was aimed at looking at cognition and working memory of dialogue interpreters. It is an explorative project, so we admitted that we know very little about the cognitive processes of dialogue interpreters and wanted to know more. And as I told you before, me and Birgitta Englund-Dimitrova ran it together, and we have a PhD candidate involved in the project, which is Alexandra Adler. It says here that it was that it ran until 2020, and I'm still here talking about it. But we got an extension, so now we're extended until 2023, and we think we are reaching some kind of answers to our explorative questions, as I hope you will see. Our research questions for the whole project was that we were interested if there were differences in the cognitive processes of experienced professional community interpreters and interpreting students when it comes to central executive functions, for example, attention sharing and switching or resistance to interference. And the first question, we aimed at doing working memory tests for these different groups and check if there were any differences in the working memory between the groups. We were also interested in knowing if there were differences in how experienced professional community interpreters and interpreting students cope with cognitive load in general and depending on language direction. And here we were interested in having them interpret in an experimental setting, so a role play, and see if there were differences in how they handled different type of cognitive load that we inflicted on them. For instance, long lists, difficult terminology, emotions of the participants, and so on. Our third question consisted of, are there differences in the required type-specific monitoring between experienced professional community interpreters and interpreting students? And here we looked at the same scripted role play or experimental interpreting setting, but looking at areas where perhaps more monitoring was required. And finally, we wanted to compare our results, especially the working memory results, to other previous studies, and then comparing perhaps community interpreters to simultaneous interpreters. So interpreters used to working mostly in dialogue interpreting and their working memory tests, and compare those to the working memory tests of simultaneous interpreters. And you may know, if you have any experience of simultaneous interpreting, then you may know that there are lots of studies with working memory tests on simultaneous interpreters. So many that there has been even literature studies written on it, but very, very few studies on dialogue interpreters or community interpreters or public service interpreters, or however you'd like to call them. And these were our methods and data. So we used the background questionnaire. We used the dialang test, and the background questionnaire was about interpreting training, the socio-demographic background, of course, but also about language use. So which language do you consider your strongest? Which language do you use most in interpreting, etc. We used the dialang test. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a computer administered online test which covers many of the European Union's languages, unfortunately not Polish. So our Polish interpreters could not do the dialang test for Polish. But anyway, it's a test where you get a result on where the participant, the test taker, is placed on the CIFAR levels. So from A1, A2, B1 would B2, C1, C2. I'm sure you know the scale of the Common European Framework for Language Knowledge, and the Dialang test is used to test that. So we decided not to have our own language testing device, but rather to use the one existing one. They also did the Raven test. So a Raven is a common intelligence test. We had scripted role plays with rich points, where we recorded the role plays with 2 cameras and also with eye tracking glasses. The interpreter wore eye tracking glasses. After the role play they did retrospection. We had an EQ test, which I unfortunately haven't been able to analyze, and I'm not sure we're going to be able to analyze it, and that's a pity, but that's called a mesquite test and worth looking into perhaps on another group at another stage. And we did working memory tests. And the working memory test, for those of you who are familiar with them, I'm not going to go into them very much in detail, but we used a 2-back test, the letter span, an operation span test, a Barouillet test, a matrix test, and an arrow flanker. And I will come back to them shortly, so I'm not going to present them now. And our participants, as you can see, were either inexperienced or students. So we had students who took the last term of 3 at our own public service interpreting training program. We also had a few students from the military interpreting training, and we had a few recent graduates from folk high schools. So all our students, all students were not part of all analyses, but we had in total 10 students with different languages. And they did, the languages were French, Spanish, and Polish. And the experienced participants were state authorized interpreters with at least 5 years of experience. And they were 7, and also French, Spanish, and Polish. And as you can see, or maybe you can't see it, but I can tell you that females were dominating. And so we had 2 male participants in the experienced group and 3 male participants in the inexperienced group, but really very domination of female participants. And then we did a test. One of our studies aimed at determining their language proficiency, and we compared the Dialang test with the self-report in our background questionnaire of their strongest language. And we did this study on part of the project, so we had 5 students and 6 inexperienced interpreters. And what was interesting here is that there was a discrepancy between the self-reports of their strongest language and the Dialang assessment. And this was for 1 of the students and for 5 of the experienced participants. And Dialang assessed all participants to have Swedish either as their strongest language or being balanced bilinguals. But as you can see from the point before, they did not assess that themselves. They were, all of them, I'd say, very clear in that one language were the stronger one. So, and this result, I'll come back to that later, I think, but this result serves to say that it is very difficult to determine language proficiency in a study group. The impact of language proficiency was done as an MA research in the project, and we looked at the data from the Spanish and Swedish interpreters, and they looked at both then we looked at the data from the Spanish and the Swedish interpreters. And what we started with there was that we looked at the language that they considered their strongest language. And the result from that study showed that both inexperienced and experienced interpreters used more strategies when they interpreted into the language which they considered their weakest language. So not the dialang test, but the language that they considered their weakest language. But, and this is also interesting from experience and what that does to interpreting, because the experienced users made use of less strategies overall. And this was found by our MA student, Thompson, and it is the same result. It confirms the result of similar research which Arumi Ribas and Vargas Urpi did in 2017. And another study that we've done on this project is the gaze patterns in dialogue interpreting. And I vividly remember this from last time I was in Warsaw that we discussed this. So I hope that my slide now is clearer, because I felt that when I was with you last time, my presentation of the gaze pattern was not completely clear. Anyway, here's what it was. We looked at all participants in the study. We looked at how they used gaze when they interpreted. So where do they look when they interpret into the language of the institution or into Swedish? Where do they look when they look into the language, the foreign language, so to say? So Spanish, Polish, or French. And where do they look? Was there different when they were listening or when they were speaking? And then we found that gaze patterns differed depending on the type of action, depending on whether they were listening and speaking, and depending on the language direction. And we found that they were gazing at the speaker, that was more common when interpreting into the client's language. So when interpreting into Polish, French, or Spanish than when they were interpreting into Swedish. And when they interpreted into the client's language, they averted gaze more. And this means that they were looking straight forward into the void. They were not looking at any of the participants. And although it wasn't significant, we could see that the experienced participants averted their gaze more in all conditions. And this may be as simple as the fact that the experienced participant knew that if they averted gaze, they could also keep the word, because that is one of the basic conditions of turn taking, that if you don't look at anyone, you're not inviting somebody to take over the turn. And inexperienced interpreters gazed more at the client's face. This was also not significant, so not a significant difference between the two groups, but it could also indicate that the inexperienced interpreters were looking for more feedback when they were interpreting. We have also looked at the use of turn taking to handle cognitive constraints, and now we're back to the cognitive constraint. So how much can you keep in your memory before you have to do something in order not to lose information or remember what you want to say, or so on and so forth. And in this study, we looked at 8 interpreters, so 4 French and 4 Spanish, and of course 4 inexperienced and 4 experienced. And the results from this was that experienced interpreters, they interpreted the rich points faster than the inexperienced interpreters. And here I should say that the rich points were the parts of the role play where we had added difficulties. So where there were areas in the role play where we expected that cognition would increase because it was more difficult. I talked about it earlier. It was perhaps a list of words or difficult terminology or difficult in terms of emotions or getting it interrupted, or a lot of different cognitively challenging situations which we had added in these reach points. And the fact that the experienced interpreters interpreted rich points faster could indicate that they were better at handling these difficulties than the inexperienced interpreters. The coupled turn, which is a term that a colleague of mine, Elisabet Geiger-Poignant, also in Stockholm, has introduced. And a coupled turn is an original utterance and the interpreted utterance. So we look at both. We don't divide them. We look at when does the speaker start and when does the interpreter finish. So all that is one coupled turn. So it's the speaker turn and the interpreter turn. And the coupled turns had similar length regardless of experience in the rich points. And the fact that these coupled turns had similar length may indicate something about the cognitive constraint. So even if you're a more experienced interpreter, so it's easier for you to handle the rich point, it may still be so that you cannot handle very much more information or handle information for a longer period of time than your inexperienced colleague. You still have to handle the turn or the conversation. We also found that experienced interpreters render information more accurately than inexperienced interpreters. This was only partly significant because it was only significant into Swedish, so not into the other language. And we found that the length of the coupled turn may indicate a limit in the processing span, which we then define as the interpreter's processing process capacity. And we say that the processing span may also be understood as a similar measure to the ear-voice span in simultaneous interpreting. I'm almost done now. I'm sorry to just throw results at you. And looking at working memory of dialogue interpreters, here we had almost all our participants. So we had the French participants, 6 of them, Spanish, 5 of them, and Polish, 4 of them. And unfortunately, we did not find any significant differences between experienced and inexperienced dialogue interpreters in any of the test data. So it's always a bit sad to report on no significant differences, but it means that in all these tests that I told you about in the beginning, tests on tests for verbal memory and for updating and so on and so forth. So the 2-back test, the matrix test, etc., we had no significant differences. So this means that in theory, we couldn't find any differences in the working memory capacity between experienced and inexperienced dialogue interpreters. Now, there may be many reasons for this. For instance, age. Obviously, the experienced interpreters are older than the inexperienced ones. We may also need more participants. And also, of course, we may not have the right tests. Maybe we were not using the right tests. Another sad result was that the significant differences for tests of working memory between professional simultaneous interpreters. And now we compared ourselves with Timarova, which did a large study on working memory of simultaneous interpreters working for the European institutions. So we have the same working memory test that Timarova used in order to be able to compare. And the professional dialogue interpreters in our study showed significant differences, meaning that they scored worse than Timarova's professional simultaneous interpreters on verbal memory, updating, and visuospatial memory. But there was no significant difference for general working memory, which is the Barouillet test, which is a test for general working memory. So what I'm hoping for now, or trying to figure out now, is that maybe the general working memory is similar between interpreters, but if you go into more specific areas of working memory, it may not be so different. And also, that was also one of Timarova's results. She said that working memory in interpreting is not, can't present it as one model. It's rather many, it's rather, I forgot what she says. It's not a one size fits all. It's a relationship of many to many. So we can find working memory differences, but it's not as easy as it will be one working memory test that will show the difference between a non-interpreter group and an interpreter group. Okay, and finally to our tentative conclusions about cognition in dialogue interpreting. So far, we believe that we have shown that experience has an impact on the interpreter's cognition. We also believe that the level of language knowledge has an impact of cognitive load, that perceived or actual language proficiency may impact the dialogue interpreter's process. We also believe that we can say that cognitive load may impact the dialogue interpreter's process. Also that there may be a universal cognitive constraint of the dialogue interpreter's working memory, and that the dialogue interpreter's working memory seems to differ from the simultaneous interpreter's working memory. So there's a lot of maybe and may and seems, but also, once again, that's research for you. And what I think that is safe to say about the cognitive challenges of dialogue interpreting is that the language symmetry is a challenge, the pace, terminology, of course, the level of compact information, how you handle emotion, and last but not least, your own working memory capacity. And with that, I'd love to discuss my results with you. I say thank you, and I'm also going to show my last slide because that is publications from the project, but I'd be happy to discuss any questions that may have arisen thus far.